So I have sort of listed here, and then I'll just go to like another chart here of just sort of a general timeline of just philosophy in general. Just like starting with like the Greeks.
A lot of this is gonna be a lot of this is gonna be Greek to me, sort of.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be like a deep
not all
dive,
of it.
like going into the nitty gritty of like the
You might have to
Socratic,
explain.
Pre-Socratic.
You might have to explain
Socratics.
certain sections, you know.
Okay.
But I mean, I did listen to a few great courses series on philosophy, Greek philosophy specifically. So I'll definitely remember some of the broad strokes. I think.
Yeah, because we can always like go
Just
from one
bad,
thing to the other.
bad
Like
at
maybe
retaining it.
sort of like stay in that area. We don't have to go equally. We could be like, okay, just a quick thing about the Greeks, and then maybe later we would tie into something that maybe it might tie into something with like modern philosophy more.
Okay. What was it? It was Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle.
Yeah,
That's one thing I
Socrates
do
was
remember.
the protege, well, sort of the teacher of
Plato.
Plato.
And then
Plato was the
teacher of Aristotle, I think.
of Aristotle. I think Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle.
Alexander the Great had some kind of...
Because I'm guessing Diogenes the Cynic or Diogenes the dog would be around that time then, like, because he met Alexander the Great. Because there's a famous instance where Alexander the Great saw Diogenes, like, out in the sun or something, and he was like, or he was like going up to ask Diogenes because he was like a famous philosopher, and he was like famous because the Cynics were sort of like rejected a lot of like worldly sort of social norms and like societal worth, and like they're very like sort of skeptical about that. That's why they're called the Cynics. So they like tended to be very like primitive and minimal, and so he was like staying out. Like that's why he's called the dog, because he was like sort of rumored to be pretty unhygienic, I think. So like he was like sitting out there, and then Alexander the Great, I think this is like I don't know if this is proven, but like he like approached the famous philosopher, and then he was like, can I get you anything, or how can I help you? And he was like, Diogenes was like, yeah, you can get out of my way so I can get more sunlight or something.
Greek.
Yeah, so we're just gonna go through all the what we sort of collectively know about philosophy, but this isn't strictly pertaining to just philosophy, like, because we're gonna include some other things, try to have like an all-encompassing type of thing, because our knowledge obviously isn't perfect. So this is just going to be sort of a collection, I guess, like a collage of different things going into a meaningful, cohesive narrative. Maybe anything from literature, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, sociology, just bits and pieces everywhere. And I guess this is going to be edited later into something more, because there's probably going to be some. It's not going to be like a perfect seamless transitions. There might be some brain farts here and there, but we're going to start out with the Greek sages of early, because I don't think philosophy had a very obvious start before that. I think you don't see written history, like you don't see like the scientific method being put to being sort of tested, or you see a lot before that, like obviously like mythology. I'm guessing like starting with like Sumer, Mesopotamia, and all like these early civilizations had like very simple explanations for the universe, physics. Like they didn't have these grand, like they weren't super critical. They didn't call it into question. They're like, these are the gods.
They just had basic creation myth narratives and all that.
Yeah, just like basic cosmology narratives. Like a lot of even today, even like some of the Bushman tribes have sort of these simple, sort of orally brought down narratives. In fact, like even a lot of like the Bible was brought down orally. Like,
well, yeah, you'll see that with like a lot of I was hearing that certain Native American tribes have their own little very basic, almost kind of cute creation myths of, God kicked the female god out of heaven. Basically, she fell down like a hole or something in the sky, and there was no land on the earth. There was no land yet, so then she fell in the water, and like one of the animals kept trying to go down to the bottom of the ocean and grab the soil and bring it up to create land for her to live on. And one of them was able to do it. It was like the otter, not an otter, but it was something like an otter or something that was able to get all the way down to grab, and then they created an island. And then she had children, I think, and then those children had humans, basically, and that's like But you'll see that a lot, and
Yeah, you
super
see
very
sort
basic.
of time and time again, like sort of these myths, creation myths, have like this interesting, like very fabulous, or very almost like, I guess, like a fable type of explanation for how the Earth started. And this is
Yeah.
obviously like, you don't
It's like
expect tribes
talking
back then.
animals.
It's like, yeah, like
It's very like kids book type
Yeah.
stuff. Not
And-
not trying to be demeaning of
yeah.
it. I just mean it's
but there's like a lot of I've noticed like a lot, I guess, in African tribes have instances of like subterfuge and trickery, and like the like sort of like the evil, or like the I guess the sort of the reason for evil to exist is because like this this evil creature sort of like shapeshifted into a lady, and then like one of the tribesmen like married her, and then like he basically like sort of duped, or the evil creature, I guess, is one of the demons in their mythology, like sort of duped them into this contract or something. And I think because I think there was marriage is a big thing. Like there's a lot of like ritualistic practices. Like there's honor is a big thing. Like sort of like arranged marriages and things, and like princesses, and there's a lot of like early type of royalty, like prince and princesses and
yeah.
stuff like that.
And I'm guessing Seven Sages of Greece is just sort of an after the fact title for 7 people, disparate people who had no real,
including
big
Thales
relation
of
to each other.
Miletus. I think they actually taught one another, from what little I know, because I didn't like do like a whole ton of digging on it, but like I think they all sort of taught each other. So I think like Thales of Miletus taught somebody else who was under him, who also became one of the 7 sages, and they basically, from what I can tell, they all had in common sort of breaking away from like using myth and religion to sort of explain the universe, instead of saying like God did this and then evil was made by this, and like
just asserting things.
So they became more analytical, and that's where like sort of the seeds of the scientific method came about, like very like empirical driven, like wait till the evidence, accumulation of
You start to see things
empirical
getting
evidence.
like sort of hewed, and like chipped away, and
whittling
everything,
away.
like all the dross and extra just extraneous useless things are kind of getting stripped away. I mean, obviously you see even in old philosophers, a lot of their theories are just absolutely ridiculous, and like just total like magic
even,
level stuff, and just they're clearly just kind of making up. But even
some
a
of
lot
like
of
the
that is
best
like
Greek
it's
philosophers
like
sort of appeal
evidence
to
based
pantheism
according to
a
how
lot
they
too.
think, at least.
Yeah.
Like it's to the best of their ability evidence based. But then looking at it now, it's like ridiculous. But even all the way up until you still have I don't know if this is related to what I was just referring to with them, but even like 1800s, of like phrenology and like people's nose sizes determine their personality.
Like the length of somebody's nose, they have a deceitful nose by
well, you'll notice with that approach, whatever that is, it's not a creation myth type of thing.
It's
Superstitious.
superstitious.
A
level
lot
of
of what it is like you'll notice how
it's by appearances.
it has the
how
facsimile of a scientific
Right.
method.
Yeah.
Notice the curvature, like they have charts and graphs.
That is
and
an
everything.
upstanding. That, ladies and gentlemen, that is the very notion of an upstanding,
they're
morally
using,
righteous behavior.
Yeah,
That is the
you'll
notion
notice-
of property, my friends.
You'll notice they're using the trappings of a some
which
kind
to-
of a
otherwise,
scientific method.
It's like the
but
seeds of their like observation.
Yeah, like
but
the forms,
Yeah.
certain forms of scientific figure are there, but the actual content is just ridiculous, and like it's not
and
based on anything.
unprovable.
But at least with that, it's like at least there is some kind of progression happening. In a lot of
it's
ways.
surprising because phrenology actually didn't really truly subside to like the early 20th century. I remember seeing like a book that was published in like 1902 or something.
And then
It
you'll
was,
have
the
like
book of character readings.
all the way to the 80s. You'll have what's his name, the guy who like bends spoons and stuff on TV.
Yeah, like
whatever
Yuri
his-
Geller. Or something.
Yeah, it's like all the way into the 80s, and it's still
it's
going
like-
on.
it's even
It's
today,
still
yeah.
happening.
I mean,
It's
to a
like,
larger,
oh my
it's like sort of
gosh.
the
not now.
minutia now.
It's
It's
really
like
not happening.
sort of like on a
now
lower
so much.
level. Like,
I just meant it's still
yeah.
happening like back then.
it's sort of like the whole bread and circus thing. It's like we'll show you all this, like these tricks, and like if you just say convincingly enough, and like Darren Brown sort of disproved like so many of these things, because he's like a magician and illusionist himself. So he's able to say it's like, no, I know I do the tricks, and this is how you do it, and he sort of reveals it. And a lot of times it's just like sort of mental things, little cues or cold readings, or like a lot with astrology a lot of times. Yeah, I'll probably check and see if this didn't
Yeah, I just want to make sure it was still going.
Well, you
it's
see
like,
that a lot of times with
it's
like
like, isn't it
astrology.
so
It's
much
like
better
you are
to
a
just
sorry.
know what's
you're-
really going on?
Yeah, it's
Or
like
do you just want to be duped by Uri Geller? Like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, 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 no.
yeah, it's like
Even if it is kind of more boring, like,
Mhm.
I kind of wish I lived in a world where people could bend spoons.
yeah,
Like, and like maybe we do live in
And
a world
it's-
where people can bend spoons.
and it's
I
not
don't,
that.
you
It's
know.
not to say that science, as we'll probably get into it more, particularly later. But like, it's not to say that science can just better everything, or that science has every single feasible answer. Scientific way is
Yeah.
the only way. Scientific method. You can only look at the world through the lens of science, and then everything will be cured. It's a remedy for literally everything. No, that's not true. And there's obviously like as we'll see with like Carl Jung, and like there's instances of like almost mystical things going on. Like he got like incredibly like more mystical later on in life. After sort of like breaking off with Freud and everything. So like there's things that he says and stuff that's like really compelling, like stuff like precognition or collective unconsciousness or like synchronicity, like instances of like very sort of otherwise like almost laughable type claims that you would make of the universe. But it's one of those things where it's like it's not something that you want to reject right away, because there's like something like saying there's this visceral type of thing, sort of like a testament to human nature of just like, yeah, we don't know everything. We don't have all the facts. It's like everybody, there is that margin of doubt. But I think at the end of the day, it's still healthier to employ sober method to be able to, especially like when making like big decisions. I think not sort of rooting all your stuff. It's like I've got like this spiritual mystic that I've been consulting on all our government and problem. But yeah,
Well, yeah, it's like I don't know why I keep having to clear my throat every 5 seconds, but it's like it's like the whole thing with like dreams are very strange, and then the whole idea of like extended consciousness and
yeah, like analytic psychology.
and what's it called, synchronicity and things like that. It's like I just wish people would be.
Archetypes.
I just wish there'd be more like, hey, here's these weird things we noticed. We don't know what they are. Here's maybe some theories here or there. We don't know if that's what it actually is. We're gonna do a little more research on this. There we go, and that's it. Like, why can't it just be
Right.
that? But instead, people are just so. I mean, they're so tempted to grab the juiciest, options and be like, oh, it's this. I know it's this. Look. This is what it is, and it's like,
Like science can't disprove it. Yeah, there's like, it's one of those things where the universe, obviously, and it's like infinite complexity, is going to generate two like events that seem meaningful, and I think it's human nature to want to draw meaningful connections between patterns.
Yeah.
Humans see patterns. We see things sort of the way we want to.
And that, by the way, what you just said is a theory. You know what I mean? Like, that's a possible explanation. I don't think it's super set in stone that that's what's really happening. I think it's possible. It's like probable that that's what's happening.
At the end,
but some,
yeah,
I don't know,
yeah.
some synchronicity type events are like a
Too
little
particular,
too,
yeah.
they're like a little too, like, even for how random everything is in the world, they're like still just a little too like,
But I think by the time, it's one of those things where it's like starting out with the seeds of like Jungian stuff, but it can easily, you can sort of get into the like new age, I think like new thought. Blavatsky, I think Helena Blavatsky, I think was one of the sort of progenitors of new thought. You can see like all this type of thinking, sort of like, if I just think about it, and if I'm just positive enough, if like attracts like, law of attraction, and if I'm just little butterflies will send messages up to heaven for me, and it's like,
I wish that's how it worked.
It feels like so good to be true, and like you garner this
good
like,
if that's how it
this
worked.
euphoric, and it's understandable. It's like there's like this sense of like telos, or like an end goal, or there's a sense of like meaning.
Yeah,
to
there's
the
like some
universe, and it's
purpose and meaning baked into everything. Ooh, wow.
But it's just
So
way too
interesting,
conjectural,
just like a
way
movie.
too
It's so interesting,
nebulous.
just like a movie.
Yeah, because like you want to spin that narrative, sort of like that. The Jungian monomyth, or the I think it was actually Joseph Campbell came up with this chart called the monomyth, and Jordan Peterson's, I think, talked about this a lot of times, where there's like a hero's journey where it starts out with like a call to action, and then there's like a conflict, there's an inner conflict, and then there's like an overcoming of that, and then I'm just sort of like doing a rough sketch up of it, but like, and then there's like he has to face the dragon sort of type of thing, and then like there's like there's finally the climax, and then there's the aftermath and whatever, and the conclusion. And it's like it's weird, you know, like the postmodernists will sort of call that into question and be like, oh, that's a or not a meta narrative, but that's of the patriarchy, that's of this dogmatic way of looking at reality. It's like, no, it's stories are more complex than that. Like a story doesn't have to be this hero's journey where, and even like George Lucas, I think, cited that type of chart as like sort of one of the impetus for like sort of Star Wars, I think. So I think we somewhat expanded on the Greek philosophy. We could just go a little bit more into like the pre-Socratics, Peripatetic school,
Yeah, that's
philosophers like Democritus,
You're
Democritus,
inundated in that.
and I'm probably gonna butcher some of these names, so excuse me in advance. Aristotelian thought and science. A lot of Aristotelian stuff seems to be about like sort of balancing human affairs and sort of being sort of like this enhanced best version of yourself type of thing is what I've sort of gleaned from it.
Yeah.
His work Nicomachean Ethics is sort of like a staple.
Nicomachean.
Yeah, Nicomachean Ethics is sort of like a staple in the realm of ethics and philosophy. And then Plato and Socrates, classical philosophy. I've noticed like a lot of like Hellenistic philosophers were polymaths. A lot of them like not only they were sort of like jack of all trades, because there seemed to be like a school of thought was just sort of like this really critical questioning attitude with pretty much all the sciences, like anything from basic arithmetic or even to like calculus or geometry and astronomy especially. A lot of astronomies I think had early roots in like the Greek school of thought, and yeah, and Plato as well, obviously, and Plato and Socrates. To start with, probably Socrates. Basically everything that there is to be known about Socrates is through Plato and his like dialogues, especially like the Republic, and so pretty much everything we know about him, like we don't know exactly when he was born, but you know there is like a general sort of like time gap that we can assume. But yeah, a lot of what Socrates was, he sort of furthered the whole scientific method, like the whole Socratic dialogue. Like you have two people sort of starting with a premise and then going from there and just sort of batting each other off and questioning it, like maybe start saying something about justice. Like, what is justice? Is it something that is it a physical sort of like manifestation of something, or do we see justice every day, or is it some vague abstract type of thing? They basically, yeah, so like they'd start off with a question and would sort of be a premise of which they'd sort of have like a dialogue about, and they bounce ideas off each other about, like, for example, like what exactly is justice? Is it like a transcendent sort of abstract ideal that exists over time and indefinitely, or like sort of like a Platonic form, or is it something that's sort of contingent and it depends on the thing, or blah blah blah, or do we see justice lived out? So he'd like start out with that, and then they'd question every aspect of it, sort of whittle it down to a sort of cohesive, logical, answer, and that's sort of how they do things.
Yeah.
Which, yeah. So
yeah, I recall the whole logic of like finding out all the things that are this thing. Like if you want to find out what a chair is, or what is the essence of a chair, it's what does every single chair have in common that all consistently makes it a chair?
What is
that is what a pure chair is. So you could be like, well, what does every chair has? Well, every chair has a seat and something to support the seat, and it's meant for humans to sit on.
Yeah, and there's differing type of gradations between what a chair could be considered. There's like love seats, which are very like just this amorphous sort of blob type of thing, which is, it defies the sort of thing of it defies the normal, I guess.
Does a chair have to have a backrest to it to be a chair?
Yeah, does it have to have? It sort of goes back to the Odysseus' ship, where if you over time you replace each component of a ship with a new component, till the whole entire ship is replaced until it's piece for piece is entirely new. Is it in essence the same ship?
Yeah.
Sort of conjures up images of sort of like cloning and like sort of like the moral implications of like, okay, so what is a self? Like,
yeah, that's
if you clone somebody, he's atom for atom, quark for quark is me, and there's going to be like sort of like Derek Parfit teleprompter one is one of my favorites, of where if you see somebody who is atom for atom, cell for cell, the same exact copy as you, who carries all your memories, who carries everything, who is like, in every which way is like indistinguishable from you, all of a sudden sort of takes your life and says, yeah, I'm going to be up on that spaceship, but you're going to have to go. Like, you're going to have to be completely like, equalized or vaporized or whatever, and you're gonna be, dead. But hey, I'll be there. You'd feel like he's an imposter, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's that dilemma. So it's like it's all about like I guess essence and trying to figure out like what
Yeah, and I
what
listened
determines
to
a self, I guess, and like we cling to these certain ideals and
I listened to
it'll be
I
different.
listened to a whole teaching company series on like identity and what the philosophy, like what makes an identity, what the I and the self and all that. And so, and it just went round and round and round and round and round of different. He was like cycling through all the different theories.
Yeah.
And it was like so exhausting just trying to, anyway, just when you thought one theory had some great points, he'd be like, but here are the problems with
Here's
that.
the counter theory.
Yeah, he'd break down every issue with it and counter arguments to it. And as far as I remember, what it came down to was basically like every theory didn't quite add up. And every
each
theory
one has their
wasn't
own
quite,
sort of flaws.
Yeah, it just didn't have the right setup to it. And the conclusion was that we just basically like don't really know and can't really define it in a...
Yeah, that's the dilemma of
yeah.
science and dealing with consciousness is that it's so... You're dealing with this almost like this recursive self-referential thing where you're like, well, in order to prove that I exist, I'm using my own logic, I'm using my own faculties, but I can't... Even that, I'm in the subjective qualia of this experiential realm of events that I perceive to be true, and I feel like I'm me. I feel like... But at the very same time, who's to say that this, you could be like sort of the classic sort of, you could be a vat in a tube or a vat in a, like you could be a solipsistic, like everything's a dream. It's like, there's always that margin of error, and like, that's sort of the conundrum with science is like, in order to prove consciousness, you need to like use consciousness to get at that. And then there'll be like the Eastern philosophy, like Buddhist way of sort of saying like, well, no, there's a self that transcends death. There's a self that's more than your thoughts, more than your memories, and because a lot of times they sort of like want you to be distant from that and not identify with that and not to be subsumed by these things that you cling to and sort of like try to like claim identity for these things. And in a way it's like there seems to be more of a consistent thing. I mean, it definitely doesn't say like, oh, Buddhism beats science 100%. It's not to say that, but it's definitely a sort of refreshing way of looking at it to say that, well, these... And I'm still I'm still not fully certain if the implication is that this self, or, well, it's not self, but it's like sort of a dualistic, or might be mixing this up, because dualism, you believe that the soul and the body are separate. You believe that the mind and the body is separate, rather, not necessarily a soul, but, or in the way that Descartes put it, is that there's your body, and then you have an immaterial spirit, is what he called it, and then those two are linked together, and then the immaterial spirit will survive death and live on, I guess, or I guess there's the whole wacky panpsychism thing where it's like, will our consciousness go into other forms of consciousness? Will we take on different forms of consciousness? And like how much does plasticity and how much can consciousness jump around? How much like autonomy? So there's like weird things we obviously like don't know anything about that, but I'm sure like David Chalmers went a lot more into that. And
and it just depends on like how convoluted of a theory do you want to come up with, and how justified is that theory?
Mm-hmm. Because like it's tempting to want to say it's like, ooh, panpsychism. It can't. There's nothing necessarily saying it that seemingly inanimate objects can exhibit consciousness.
Yeah, but you can't just be
but
like.
It's also not like the first intuitive or not. It's obviously not the first like deduction you want to make from that, though. It's like it's a little bit hasty, I think.
Well, yeah, you can't just say like the negative of a thing. Be like, well, I mean, there's nothing to say they can have consciousness. It's like, okay, that's fine, but if you're gonna be making a claim like that, you have the burden of proof. Like,
right.
What evidence is there that a rock has any form of consciousness? Well, based on every standard of determining
consciousness. Well, what do you mean by consciousness? It could be the ability just to be sentient, or the ability to, I think, was it Chalmers, I think, sort of set like a definition of like, well, its ability to say that I am, or to that to
that
experience
it's like something
events,
to be that
I think,
thing.
outside to what it's like to
like
be this thing.
Yeah. So
does like a tree having a?
Is it like something to be a computer? No, it's not. Based on this is what I'm just saying is that based on every possible metric that we use to look at and determine and talk about consciousness, based on all of those things, a rock is not conscious, period. Right. And there's no good reason to believe
because
that a
there's
rock
also
is conscious.
Instances of like trees, I think, with the like open systems, and I'm not too sure about my memory on biology is sort of is rusty, but there's examples of like trees sort of having like an open system and using like like a almost like a reciprocal type of relationship of like they'll I don't know, like their system will open and take in oxygen or something, and then it will shut, and it's like a very simple type of like schema of like what a sort of like almost like a sentient thing, obviously not complex, but like obviously like even like somewhat analogous to like machinery too. Like there's like varying layers of like complex machinery. There's some that like they're simply just wind up toys really, and you just sort of they have like limits and everything. Or even like Descartes sort of thought of ducks as like autonomous.
Consciousness is arising from.
Yeah.
There's no at no point, and this is the way that I'm just kind of going by the way Sam Harris words it, because it's a very succinct way of.
You a Sam Harris boy?
Yeah, it's basically just the idea is that you cannot pinpoint where or how in the series of things happening and synapses firing with humans, or well, that's just the whole mystery of consciousness.
Right.
But with in the case of a robot or like a super advanced computer or toaster or whatever example you want to use of some kind of piece of machinery or tech or whatever, it's like at nowhere in that setup can you pinpoint where consciousness would be arising. Right. Nowhere. And it goes beyond it goes beyond just the mystery
issues with AI too.
Consciousness. I think in the example of a robot or even a super advanced robot, in that example, there is just no causal link possible to the point where I think that it confirms that a very advanced robot just would not be conscious. Period.
Yeah, because
you know exactly
even
what's
the most advanced robot we can think of, like hyper intelligent, aware,
you'd still be able to explain exactly how it functions the way it functions.
Because it always goes back. There's almost like the prim and movements. Like we're still sort of like the unmoved mover that created them and set them in motion and did all this. So everything they do is still derived concepts or processes that we sort of like sketched up in art. Like, so everything they do is still just derivative of how.
Yeah, you can map out exactly. You'd be like, well, I know why it's giving this response when I ask this question because we created it to do that. Da 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 da. Even if it's whereas with human beings, we don't understand how exactly the brain works in every single way.
But what is sort of interesting is sort of like the idea, like in Ex Machina, going back to cinema, is the idea.
Cinema!
Is the idea of like AI being so like hyper realistic to the point that it can just integrate into society and just like live,
Which is like, that's an interesting question in terms of the future and building, androids and all that. That's very interesting in terms of all that. I don't find it at all interesting in terms of would androids eventually have souls? Would they have consciousness? I think that's like a totally...
Do androids dream of electric sheep?
I think that's just a completely moot point. It doesn't matter. This is my view, at least. I don't care how advanced an android is, or the AI is, unless you got into like, cyborg, like half human, or androids with actual like human brain parts or weird shit. Like if you're gonna get into that, that's a different story. But I'm not getting into that. I'm just talking about purely mechanical based AI, like even super advanced, Ex Machina level AI. I think in that entire world, at no point should it be an interesting discussion of like Star Trek Data level. Does this thing have consciousness? The answer is no, no, every time. No matter how realistic it is, it does not have consciousness. There's no freedom. There's no consciousness. Nothing.
Yeah, because ultimately everything's going to be, even if it's like a Her type of thing, from the movie Her, type of AI where it's like, ooh, it learns from itself,
but
and
it's
it
so
grows,
realistic,
and it's
so
complex, and it's
at this point
it's
it may
compelling,
as well.
But at the same time, I think it's this nature in humans. I think they're so complex in the sense that they're also like informed by their biology to an extent. So there's like biological functions. It's like humans lack that, so everything that they're going to experience, like it's just going to be this artificial mock-up of what, like, oh, these are moods that humans go through, and it's like it's due to like a very complex neuro, like chemicals firing off, or dopamine, or what, or there's such this panoply of different things, causalities. It's like you can't just mock that up like glide,
even if you this is the
that
whole
easily.
thing of
I
even
think
if you replicated
it would always have that
certain
uncanny valley
biological
type of effect.
systems like adrenaline and hormones and the body parts or whatever, you still wouldn't have necessarily have the consciousness to go with it, and that's like
Right.
the problem. But I think and it's like there's definitely interesting conversations like with like say Blade Runner. I think part of the message of Blade Runner was that the Rachel character was so much like a human that it kind of got to the point where it's just like, what difference does it make? She may as well be human.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which I think is a really cool idea, and it's a really cool thing for like a plot of a movie. And there would be instances with a sufficiently advanced Android AI, whatever, where it could kind of get to the point where it's like, functionally, we may as well treat this like a human. You know what I mean? And
hey,
then there's
we already have more NPCs than we can count in the real world anyway.
libs.
Yeah.
And then, well, there's also, and this is also another part of it, is that there's also the sort of ethical question of how should we treat androids, not in terms of them or them having rights or them having free will or consciousness, because I don't think they have any of those things, right? The question would be more of like an ethical framework of how should we treat androids given how it would affect us, how we treated them. You know what I mean? If we started abusing androids and whatever, what would that do to us psychologically? So you see, it's all coming back. It's still all route. The ethical concerns
And then it also
all
depends,
loop
like,
back
can they
to us as
process
humans.
complex feelings? Do they have the capacity to
Well, they don't
to
because
go
they're not
through,
conscious.
Like, yeah,
That's the
unless
problem.
they're like again like sort of that hyper
Unless
complex.
you wanted to claim that at some point in their advancedness or their construction, consciousness had arisen. If you want to claim that, then you can start going into, do they have rights? Should we treat them better ethically because they
and
have
that's also an
feelings?
interesting question in general of like when consciousness arises.
Well, that's the thing,
goes
and
into
that's the
the
problem.
whole
You
biology
can't
of it.
answer that question because no one even knows how it arrived. You know what I mean?
So a lot about dialogues. There's a lot of them in like the Republic. He basically used like Socrates. He almost like sort of mythologized him, but I'm sure he was probably true to his character. Like he didn't. Yeah, but like I said, everything we know about Socrates is through Plato. So you have to sort of trust his
Possible
claims.
filtering of that.
Yeah, but yeah, he used them almost as characters. He'd have Socrates. Sometimes he'd have Glycon, I think, who is Socrates' brother. Again, like sort of fictional versions of real people. And in the Republic, there's a lot of meaty type of things in it. There's some, when you take into context of like the Greek and the Greek society, it seemed to be so open. They still had like, even though they're pretty open-minded, especially by the time, like the pre-Socratics and like the Seven Sages and everything, despite that, there was a lot of stuff with like sort of pedophilia going on, and like it seemed like the justice system was sort of messed up. Like even though it was a democracy, it seemed like a lot of times there was these arbitrary decisions, like take Socrates' death, for instance, like the way that like there wasn't like an orderly system. And again, like you can't really expect at that age either for there to be like a laid out, rational method of justice is thought out. It's like you can't really expect that being so early, so long ago. But just sort of like the way that they accused him of like heresy or corrupting a youth, I think was the main thing, and sentencing him to death by eating hemlock. It just seemed like very hasty and like almost mob rule, like a little bit anarchic. Again, these are just sort of like rough details. So yeah, there's some instances where Plato was like excommunicated from Athens, I think. So a lot of it, like I think there's sometimes he went to Egypt, I believe like that's where a lot of Greek geometry comes from. Like Euclid, I think, was excommunicated and ended up somewhere in Cairo, Egypt, and I think that's where like this idea of shapes and perfect forms, and well, obviously that's Plato's idea, but the idea of like truth and like these axioms and like sort of like these perfect postulates to geometry arose. So yeah, and then there was Plato. He seemed to be a little bit more of a moralizer than Socrates. There's a lot more issues dealing with like ethics, I think, on his part, how one ought to act. And yeah, he was sort of
Aristotle seemed a little bit more like on the playful side of like messing with people's opponents and maybe not taking as much of a stand on certain things and just discussing it instead of taking a stance.
Yeah, he seemed to be a lot about like balance, I think. And yeah, Plato, he's not as as democratic as people think, because there's like Athens was big on like democracy, the people rule. He actually was anti-democracy in a lot of ways. He wrote, I believe there's like in one of his dialogues, there's a what he called a ship of fools, which is like sort of an allegory of how democracy goes awry with, sort of in a nutshell, a bunch of people are stuck together on a ship that's going from, sort of two different destinations.
Yeah, it's an argument basically for you need a captain, like one person leading the whole thing instead of letting the ship just, even if everybody decides together of going one way, that doesn't mean they necessarily know what they're doing.
Right. So just because you're ruling from the people and there's like an egalitarian equal opportunity for everybody doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good thing, because it could mean that maybe the populace has the wrong idea. So Plato, his idea was actually philosopher kings.
Right.
Rather than having
kind of really nice sounding idea.
Yeah, it's enticing.
More than likely never ever work.
It never comes to fruition.
Unfortunately.
Quite right. I mean, you see like instances of like you'll see like Roman senators, Roman consuls, like, Marcus Aurelius is probably a good example of like the philosopher king. But it all depends on like sort of like
where you have just somebody who's a really great person running things for a while, but that's not the usual way it works.
But I'm guessing his idea was sort of inculcate the youth and like get them like super in this rigid. In fact, his methods sound a little bit draconian, like his idea of sort of wanting to get the kids at like the best, and like it pretty much like if they didn't prove themselves in like the first few years, like he was like really strict. And like, like they weren't meant for the academy, they'd be thrown out, and it's like, well, go on to the next best. It was sort of like almost a survival of the fittest, and like the best of the best would be there, like the intellectual, but they'd be inculcated in everything. It would be like the arts, philosophy, mathematics, and athleticism, and it would be all sort of this holistic idea of well-being and like goodness. He thought about goodness in sort of like light. A lot of times he uses like allusions to like what an internal idea of truth is, as sort of just being like light. It's like the sun. It's like, I think one of his allegories is of the divided line, I think, and I think it's like, or maybe it's the allegory of the sun, I think, but
allegory,
basically just alluding to like, well, if this is goodness, or this, well, we know this isn't good. We know, like being incurious and being, suspending reason, or, like there's like this idea of sort of searching for truth, and which is explored in his allegory of the cave as well, which I think is one of his best ideas, or because it deals with truth, world of appearances. I think is sort of like he has like a really good grasp on that, and like so this idea of like if you're stuck in a cave since you're born, and like I think it's like a group of people, like maybe 3 people are stuck in a cave and they're tied behind their backs and they're seeing shadows reflected on the cave walls, and they're pretty much any idea they have about the outside world comes from this sort of puppet show, I think, because there's like figures that are reflected
shadows.
on it.
They just think the shadows are the thing in and of themselves.
They think those are the things themselves, but it's merely just appearances. It's merely a delusion. So like one of them gets free, and I'm sure you know this already, but like one of them escapes and sees the light, but is like blinded by it at first because it's so like it's so overpowering, and then but like once he adjusts his eyes and finally sees the world for what it is, he's like, oh, this is actual truth, and it's like this transcends the world of just mere appearances and shadows. So he ventures in to get like his friends unshackled and to see the world too, but it like takes some like actual convincing to get them to do that. So yeah, it's like all about like sort of like journeying towards like true knowledge, eternal wisdom, and sort of Platonic ideas, which actually influenced a lot of religious thought, like Christianity, especially theology. You find like ideas of like good and evil are these Platonic eternal forms, and I think Schopenhauer at one point sort of alluded to like a Platonic view of like there being like one idea of like an animal or something that was like sort of a perfect form, and that it each one was just a mock-up of that idea or something. Or he might not have been subscribing to it, but like it's like obvious that Plato's forms were obviously influential, and I think Nietzsche mentioned them as well, but he sort of mockingly talked about Plato and sort of said like, where are these eternal forms? Like, is it like he'd like mock things like, is it a tablet of eternal forms, like sort of sarcastically saying, like maybe mocking like there not being enough evidence, or maybe because he was more relativist, he was more existentialist, because I guess this idea of absolute value was too dogmatic to him, I think, and that's maybe what that might have been his contention with Plato. Could be wrong. So that's that, and on to Stoicism. This is mostly Roman philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca the Younger. There's actually two different Senecas. There's a Seneca the Wiser, I think, which I think is the younger.
Isn't there was
But I think
was
one of them
also
might have been like might have been a
I think you might be thinking
physicist
of,
rather than a
are you
philosopher.
sure you're not thinking of Pliny the Elder and Pliny
Yeah.
or wait, was it? It was Pliny.
I think there was a Pliny the Younger and a Pliny the Elder.
Yeah, I thought they had a different title that was like Pliny the Elder and then Pliny the something rather.
Yeah, so Seneca, Epictetus, or Epictetus.
Check that up actually.
There's a lot of similarities to like Eastern Buddhist thought in the initial assessment that life is suffering and ways in which people can make peace with that. Stoicism is one of those rare cases of really almost like a one-size-fits-all type of wise thing. It doesn't carry any baggage with it. It's mostly just honest, sort of just this honest sort of observation of life and like knowing that, well, this is gonna, it's just gonna be sort of this preponderance of suffering, and if I know for it to be that, if I make peace with that, and not to say that you make peace with it in sort of an Epicurean way where you sort of evade it or you try to chase just pure pleasure instead. Not to say that's actually Epicurus's views in the slightest, actually, because there's actually a sort of a misnomer with Epicureanism in the sense that he actually wasn't as hedonic as people thought. Like he actually had sort of these retreats where he'd encourage people to sort of give up their vices and give up sort of licentiousness and drunkishness. And yeah, Stoicism seems to have like that Buddhism type of almost like a one size fits all. It doesn't carry a lot of baggage or like you don't have to subscribe to any one view of looking at things. Like you can just apply that type of thinking. And yeah, I definitely, while there are some little things in it, like it's interesting, like if you read like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is a famous sort of work exploring Stoicism, you'll see a lot of what he said, at least it came across to me, as almost something that somebody really sort of reasonable and rational, and I don't mean that in like this sort of cringy sort of Redditor atheist level 1000 type of thing. I just mean sort of like in a common sense,
Yeah, I read the
person.
Meditations. It's very far ahead of its time. It feels it's got a very kind of modern tone to it, the way he talks and how he talks, but so it's very like modern.
And like there was like a few mentions of like, I think like Roman sort of gods, I think, in there, but it seemed to me like it wasn't like this, if it was an allegiance to any form of polytheism or what have it, it didn't sound like a very rabid like dogmatic version of it. It seemed like a thought out one.
Yeah, maybe almost like, it almost seems just the way that book reads, and some of these people, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that they were like secret atheists or something. You know what I mean? Like they're
almost doesn't sound like those two views are compatible, like Stoicism and
you don't think they're compatible?
It almost doesn't seem like they are, I think, but
I don't see how. I thought it was all about. Well, I guess I'd have to hear your explanation.
Yeah, because I don't think there's like an expunging or a requirement. I don't think it's more like a lifestyle thing.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, it almost doesn't seem like it leaves room for
or agnosticism or
but,
something like that. Like it just didn't seem like he was all much concerned with anything religious at all. So like you'd think somebody talking about. I mean, the Meditations are more like the main theory is that the Meditations were written as basically a reminder notebook for himself, and not
for him to refer
they
to.
were not written as memoirs. It wasn't written, I don't think, as a diary either. It wasn't really a
or
diary.
Like a set of laws for somebody else.
Yeah, it seemed to just be a notebook type thing with reminders and basically just his meditations.
Yeah, it's odd seeing Stoicism have like a surge in popularity recently, semi-recently at least, with like Jack Dorsey and I'm not sure if Jeff Bezos does this, but there's sort of the whole like cold showers thing and like sort of self-abnegation, sort of denying the flesh, denying denying sort of immediate pleasures, as like a sense of like maintaining like character and goal oriented and like visualizing like what do I want this goal, and sort of just rather than having like very very tough on yourself goals in the right off the bat, you know, like oh I have to hit the gym like every day this week, you know, it's an impossibly high thing. Instead you're every day you're making, you know, increasingly more tougher, you know, in increments and like slight increments changes to getting where you want to be. So you're like, okay, well, instead, I'll just go to the gym twice a week. You know, I'm starting maybe on the assumption that maybe I'm not going at all. So I'll try going once a week, and then maybe after 2 weeks, go twice a week, and then eventually get to your desired goal, which is very much a Buddhist type thing, too, where you're just making peace with the fact, well, I'm not going to get this immediate thing, you know, like this accumulation of a goal or a look or a discipline has to be, you know, like there's hard work into getting it, but it's kind of like Wu Wei too, like that. I think that's a Taoist teaching in the teachings of Lao Dao, I think Lao Dao, where you don't necessarily have like this rigid schedule for the way everything has to go during the day, but instead you sort of leave it up to sort of this flow of events, and you're like, well, I'm not going to be super strict on myself. I'm just going to sort of like let, you know, like I think one of his quotes is that nature doesn't rush, like nature doesn't have a plan, nature doesn't, you know, doesn't have like this due date, but yet everything, like she's not rushing, but yet everything gets done, you know, everything arrives peacefully. And I guess, you know, using that in the context of people is just like being more realistic and saying, well, I know I'm not going to be able to acquire this goal right off the bat, but if I just, you know, let Wu Wei, and it's not to say, you know, because one of the contention is like, oh, so that's an excuse to be lazy then, like I can just sit around and just Wu Wei, you know, and like do nothing and everything will just sort of come. It's like, no, it's more of like following, like you still exert yourself, but it's more about not exerting yourself like worthlessly, like not squandering your energy or squandering like, you know, to the point where it's like desultory, like you're just like, well, I'm just gonna, if I don't get this project done, it's okay, I can come back to it with a fresh mind. And yeah